The first thing he noticed was the silence on the right side of the airplane. It was late afternoon over the grey, chopped skin of the Adriatic. The 24th mission of the month, and the B-24 Liberator shook as if someone were trying to tear its wings off by hand. 3 engines still turned. Number 3 had gone first, coughing smoke and oil and then freezing into a motionless blur. Number 4 followed half an hour later, the prop stuck at a bad angle, dragging like an anchor. Now the big bomber flew on 2 engines, far from Italy, far from home, with the bomb bay empty, but the fuel gauges dropping like stones. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Inside the cockpit, the noise was absolute. 2 Pratt and Whitney twin Wasps screaming at war emergency power, prop tips flirting with the speed of sound. The control column shook under the pilot's hands. Every few seconds, a hard buffet ran through the airplane as a gust grabbed the high-aspect wings. Somewhere behind them, the bomb bay doors rattled. Farther aft, the long fuselage twisted, flexing like the spine of a wounded animal. "Fuel!" Captain Daniel Harris shouted, though he could hardly hear his own voice. "Not good," the co-pilot, Lieutenant McKay, yelled back, glancing at the gauges. "Main tank's almost dry. We're on the reserves." Harris looked out past the crazed plexiglass of the side window. The sun slanted low. That meant west, which meant Italy, which meant home. If the 2 remaining engines kept turning, if the fuel lasted, if the wind did not shift against them, if the flak holes in the wings did not widen into something worse, 2 engines on a B-24 was survivable in theory. The manuals spoke of it in dry, cautious lines. Maintain airspeed above minimum control. Feather failed engines promptly. Avoid sharp turns. Instructors at training fields in Texas and Kansas drilled it into them with calm voices and chalk on blackboards. But the manual did not say much about flying a Liberator 400 miles across open water at winter altitudes on 1 engine. That possibility lived only in rumors, stories traded in mess halls and briefing tents, tales that usually ended with parachutes blossoming over enemy territory, or with crews fished half-frozen out of the sea by rescue launches, if they were lucky. Stories like that were not supposed to end with a lumbering 4-engined bomber limping all the way home on a single working motor. And yet, weeks before this mission, in a drafty hangar on a foggy Italian field, one technical sergeant had begun to ask himself a question the manuals refused to touch. What would it take to make a B-24 truly capable of that impossible return? His name was Tom Carver, crew chief of the aircraft, whose nose art read 4 of a kind, though on the forms it was just another series of numbers. He was 27, the son of a machinist from Pennsylvania, and he had spent most of his adult life surrounded by engines. Before the war, he serviced trucks and buses on cold concrete floors that smelled of oil, rubber, and cigarettes. After induction in 1942, the Army Air Forces gave him a toolbox, a pair of coveralls, and a thick binder of technical orders. In theory, those orders covered everything: fuel system layout, oil pressure tolerances, maximum permissible temperature on cylinder heads in climb and cruise. What you could do, what you must never do, how long an engine could run at climb power before a mechanic somewhere far away would shake their head over a cracked cylinder and write operator abuse in the margin. In practice, the orders had gaps in all the places that mattered when flak and fighters entered the equation. Tom learned that the first winter he spent in Italy in a line of olive-drab tents pitched in churned-up mud beside a steel mesh runway. The B-24s of the 15th Air Force flew long missions from those fields, over the Adriatic, up the Danube, across Austria and southern Germany, oil refineries at Ploiești, marshalling yards at Linz, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, bridges, distances on the map that, when translated into hours in the air, did not leave much margin for surprises. Surprises came anyway. An oxygen system that froze at altitude, a propeller governor that went wild, a fuel cap left loose by a distracted ground crewman, venting gasoline to the slipstream, an engine that lost oil pressure with 200 miles still to go. Tom watched crews limp back, those who could. Sometimes they arrived on 3 engines, with one propeller feathered and the corresponding nacelle streaked black with oil. Sometimes on 2, the pilot fighting the yaw with both feet and one arm, while the other hand cranked down landing gear that no longer responded to hydraulics. Once, a Liberator came over the field at low level, one wing shiny with fuel. The pilot got it onto the ground, rolled out, and only then did the crew see the ragged hole in one of the main tanks where a shell had punched through, and sometimes an airplane simply did not return at all. Carver's job, strictly defined, was to keep his assigned aircraft in compliance with those technical orders, check the spark plugs, inspect the magnetos, clean fuel filters, monitor hours on each engine, and note when it was due for overhaul. When something broke, he was to fix it using prescribed parts, prescribed tools, prescribed methods. But Tom carried the same quiet doubt as Sergeant William Ground on that faraway Mustang field, that what worked on a test range in Ohio might not be enough over the Balkans. Out there, reality came with flak bursts, tracer fire, icing, and fuel calculations that assumed everything would go exactly as planned. The B-24s engines, 4 identical 14-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R1839s, were robust machines. Each delivered roughly 1,200 horsepower in cruise, more in short bursts. Each had its own fuel and oil system, its own controls. In theory, any one of them could drive the airplane alone. Briefly, in clean air, with the gear up and flaps retracted, the trouble was not raw power. The trouble was drag, fuel, and heat. Lose one engine and feather the propeller, and the airplane might hold altitude with the other 3, at the cost of higher fuel consumption. Lose 2 on the same side, and the drag and asymmetry could become unmanageable. Lose 3, and according to the cautious text of the manuals and the grimmer verdict of experience, you were supposed to accept the inevitable. Turn toward friendly ground if you had the fuel. If not, order the crew to bail out and hope everyone cleared the tail before the airplane tumbled. It was during a cold week in January, when the snow in the Apennines turned the horizon white and the morning briefings began in the dark, that Tom started to work through the problem in his head. It began with a debriefing. One of the group's Liberators had taken heavy damage over Vienna. The pilot lost 2 engines to flak, then a third to overheating on the way home. They ditched within sight of the Italian coast. Rescue boats picked up most of the crew, but the radio operator drowned when a wave pitch-poled the dinghy. In the debrief tent, the pilot spoke in a quiet voice, his hands shaking. "We could see the field," he said. "We just couldn't stay in the air." Tom was not supposed to be there. Crew chiefs did not sit in on pilot narratives, but one of the engineering officers had asked him to drop off some forms, and no one sent him away. So he listened. "How long did you run number 2 at emergency power?" the officer asked. "Too long," the pilot answered. "We had no choice. With 3 out, if I pulled it back, we started to sink." "And the fuel situation?" "Marginal from the turn. We had to take the long way around a flak box. Burned more than planned." Later, back in the hangar, Tom stood alone under the wing of 4 of a kind, looking up at the nacelles. The olive-drab paint was streaked with oil. Exhaust stains fanned back from the cowl flaps in grey-black trails. Above him, the corrugated aluminum skin of the wing gleamed pale in the moonlight. He thought of the pilot's voice, the words, "We could see the field," and of all the variables that sat between a mission plan and an actual return. What killed the damaged B-24, he decided, was not just the flak. It was the fact that the engines and the systems that fed them had been designed for balanced operation, 4 sharing the load, even 3. Once you tried to ask one engine to do the work of 4, Everything around it ran outside its intended envelope. Heat built up, oil thinned, bearings began to run dry. Drag from dead propellers and half-extended control surfaces turned thrust into waste, and fuel, running through a plumbing system, never meant for such uneven flow, pooled in some tanks while others ran dry. What if that could be changed? Just a little. Not with new parts from factories in the United States. They would not arrive in time, if at all. But with the tools and metal he had in his hands, with clamps, hoses, and the sort of quiet mechanical improvisation that no manual could sanction. He did not think of it as a grand plan. It began as a series of small questions. If one engine had to carry most of the load, could he improve its oil cooling enough to keep it alive at high power for hours instead of minutes? If fuel needed to be concentrated in the tanks feeding that one engine, could he give the crew a way to cross-feed more efficiently instead of relying solely on the slow electric transfer pumps? If drag was the enemy, could he ensure that failed propellers would feather cleanly and stay feathered even if hydraulic pressure failed or control cables were shot away? For each question, the technical orders had a chapter that outlined the standard procedures and forbade unauthorized alteration. For each, reality offered a counter-argument, the faces of crews at dawn stepping into the frost-rimmed jeeps that took them to the flight line, men who knew that if anything went wrong, they would pay the price, not the paper. Tom's first experiments were small and invisible. He began with the oil coolers. On a B-24, each engine drove its oil through a finned radiator buried in the wing. Air flowed through it via ducts whose doors could be opened or closed from the cockpit. The system worked well enough in textbook conditions. Under sustained high power, with the airplane loaded and the air thin and cold, temperatures could climb faster than those little doors and ducts could manage. The manuals specified a certain clearance for the cooler flaps when closed, a gap to prevent jamming from ice or dirt. Tom measured that gap on 4 of a kind and reduced it slightly, filing the stops and adjusting the linkages until, when the crew pulled the handle in the cockpit, the doors sealed more tightly and directed more of the slipstream through the radiator instead of leaking around it. It was a small change, reversible, and no one on inspection picked it up. In the engine nacelles, he added simple deflectors made from scrap aluminum, riveted into the ducting where they would not be obvious. They guided more air over the hottest parts of the cooler cores. He was careful to keep them within what his own judgment told him was safe. Too much restriction, and the flow would choke, raising temperatures instead of lowering them. On the fuel side, he studied the plumbing diagrams until the lines and valves swam before his eyes. 4 main wing tanks, auxiliary tanks in the bomb bay when needed, cross-feed valves that allowed any engine to draw from more than one tank, in theory. In practice, those valves could be hard to reach in combat. Under fire, with smoke in the cockpit and the aircraft buffeting, pilots did not have the luxury to trace the exact position of each handle. Tom could not redesign the system. What he could do was label it in a way that made more sense to a man who had minutes, not hours, to think. He repainted the handles, not with regulation stencils, but with broad color bands and arrows that indicated at a glance which tanks fed which engines and which valves needed to be opened to concentrate fuel on engines 1 and 2, the inner pair. More controversially, he added a small, hand-lettered plate beside the cross-feed manifold. In extreme emergency, it read in block capitals, "Feed one engine only. Close all others." Below it, he sketched a simple pattern of valve positions, 1 line for normal, 1 for a situation where only a single engine could be kept alive. He knew that if some inspector from a stateside depot saw it, there would be trouble. But in the thin, ice-rimmed air over the Adriatic, that plate might mean the difference between fuel spread thinly across 4 feeds and fuel concentrated where it could actually keep one propeller turning. His most truly forbidden change, the one that would have drawn a reprimand faster than any paint, sat hidden behind a small access panel in the wing. There, where the oil scavenging lines converged on one of the engines, he installed an extra bypass using a length of high-temperature hose and a pair of clamps he had traded cigarettes for at a British maintenance unit. The purpose was simple. If an engine's normal return path became partially blocked by damage or sludge, crewmen could open this path from the cockpit by pulling a cable he ran, thin and almost invisible, along an unused conduit to the engineer's station. In a clean, new airplane, that bypass did nothing. Its valve stayed closed. In a battered bomber, limping home, with one engine far beyond its design duty, it allowed oil to keep circulating even as temperatures rose, delaying the moment when the bearings burned and the crankshaft seized. None of this altered the basic design. None made the B-24 into something it was not. It was, in Tom's mind, the difference between following rules written for peacetime test ranges and bending them in the face of wartime reality. He did not advertise his work. He mentioned only the labels and the cleaner feathering mechanisms, that last achieved by scrupulous adjustment and occasionally swapping a borderline governor for the best one in the spare pile, regardless of what the paperwork said about rotation. Pilots noticed that his airplane seemed, as they put it, tighter. Engines ran a little cooler. Feathering happened cleanly, without the maddening half-feather that left a dead prop dragged half-broadside to the wind. The group engineering officer, a tired captain, who had buried too many men that winter, looked the other way when rumors of Carver's little tricks reached his ears. "Just don't write them down," he told Tom once in a low voice over a mug of bad coffee. "And do not talk about them in front of inspectors. You understand?" Tom nodded. He understood very well. What he was doing lived in the grey zone, between ingenuity and insubordination, between safeguarding lives and taking a gamble with machines that did not belong to him. And then came the mission that would test whether his private calculations meant anything at all. The target, briefed in a crowded tent that smelled of wool and wet canvas, was an oil refinery complex in Hungary. Distance, hundreds of miles each way. Threats, heavy flak, experienced German fighters, winter weather over the mountains and the sea. The maps on the boards showed black flak concentrations, red routes, blue alternates. The air echelon commander traced lines with a pointer, speaking in a measured tone that tried and failed to hide his own unease. By then, Four of a Kind and its crew were on their 15th mission, together. Harris, the pilot, trusted his men, and he trusted his airplane a little more than most, though he would not have been able to say exactly why. He only knew that when Carver said, quietly, "She's ready," on the morning of a flight, that meant something. That day, as the ground crew pulled the chocks and the four engines roared in sequence, Tom stood at his usual post at the edge of the runway, goggles on, scarf pulled up against the bitter wind. He watched the B-24 roll, tail lifting, wings flexing. For a moment, it seemed too heavy, too ungainly. Then, the main wheels left the steel mat, the gear tucked away, and the bomber climbed into the low clouds, joining the rising pattern of others all around it. After takeoff, his role, like that of every mechanic, shifted from active to passive. On the ground, he could touch metal, turn wrenches, change things. Once the airplane disappeared beyond the horizon, all that remained were his earlier decisions, locked into clamps and bolts and lines of paint. The rest was out of his hands. Hours later, as twilight began to gather above the Adriatic, those decisions would become the only thing standing between Four of a Kind and the cold, grey water below. Hours later, as twilight gathered above the Adriatic, those decisions became the only thing standing between Four of a Kind and the cold, grey water below. They had made the run in as briefed, formation at altitude, contrails streaming, bomb doors open over the maze of tanks and pipes that made up the refinery. Black puffs of flak blossomed in ordered rows, then in a chaos of bursts as German gunners walked their fire up to the altitude band they knew the Americans favored. The bomb run itself lasted less than a minute, but in the crew's memory it stretched into something much longer, a tunnel of noise and invisible trajectories. "Bombs away," the bombardier called, voice taut, and the Liberator lurched lighter. They were turning away when the flak found them. The first hit came under the left wing, near number 1 engine. The blast slammed the airplane sideways, popping rivets in the leading edge and punching jagged holes through the aluminum skin. Shrapnel sliced through the wing. severed a fuel line, and tore chunks out of the aileron. Harris fought the controls, feeling the left wing suddenly heavy, sluggish. The second burst was nearer the right wing. A fraction of a second later, it was one of those near misses that did not look disastrous at first, just another flower of dark smoke boiling in the air. Then, number 3 engine flickered, spat a sheet of flame from the exhaust ring, and the oil pressure needle dropped in a single, terrifying sweep. "Number 3's hit!" the flight engineer shouted. "Oil pressure gone. She's running away." Harris did not hesitate. "Feather 3, he ordered. The engineer grabbed the feathering switch, thumbed the safety catch aside, and pressed. In the nacelle, the propeller blades began to twist, turning their thin edges into the wind instead of their broad faces. For a moment, the big, four-bladed prop spun faster, clawing at the air. Then it slowed, the pitch change complete, and came nearly to a stop, now aligned like a narrow cross, to minimize drag. "3 feathered," the engineer reported, breathing hard. The airplane yawed, nose tugging toward the dead engine. Harris pushed in right rudder, trimmed, felt the Liberator settle into a new, unbalanced equilibrium. They were still in enemy airspace, still at altitude. Below and around them, other bombers, some smoking, some whole, were turning too, trying to follow the briefed route away from the target. Fighters appeared then, as they almost always did. Dark crosses against the pale sky, diving in from above and ahead. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, sleek, single-engined fighters that could slash through a formation and be gone before the dorsal gunners could bring their guns properly to bear. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high," one of the waist gunners yelled, though the call was mostly redundant. Everyone could see them. The top turret opened up first, twin .5 machine guns hammering arcs of tracer into the sky. The tail guns joined, then the side positions, each gunner tracking a different slashing shape through his sights. The fighters came on, cannon and machine gun fire, reaching out in thin streams the eye could not quite follow, until sudden sparks jumped from wing and fuselage. 4 of a kind took at least 2 of those hits. One round smashed through the plexiglass at the nose and buried itself in the bombardier's instrument panel, sending slivers of plastic through his cheek. Another struck the right wing, near number 4 engine, and this time there was no question of the damage. The engine coughed, belched an ugly belch of dark smoke, and its rhythm went ragged. "4's losing power," the engineer reported, his voice high, manifold pressure all over the place. "Can you keep it?" Harris shouted. "Not at this load. Temperature's rising. If we stay in formation, we'll cook it." The formation commander's voice came over the interphone, calm, distant. "Red 3, you're dropping back. Close it up." Harris looked at the red indicator light on the engine panel. He thought of the weight of fuel they still carried, of the drag of open bomb bay doors now swinging shut, of the flak still climbing up toward them. "We can't hold it," he said, more to himself than anyone. Then he made a choice that every pilot dreaded, and some never survived. "Tell them we're pulling out," he said to McKay. "We'll go down and try to make it on our own." McKay swallowed, keyed the mic. "Lead, Red 3. 2 engines out on the starboard and port sides. We're dropping out of formation. We'll attempt return on 3. There was a short pause. The voice from lead came back. No condemnation in it, just fatigue. "Roger, Red 3. Godspeed. Report if you can." Harris eased the yoke, dropping his Liberator out of the tight box and into the turbulent air beneath. The escort fighters and the other bombers moved on without them, held in place by orders, fuel calculations, and the hard logic of massed operations. Alone now, lower, they became just one more wounded bird among many scattered across the Balkans. They lost number 4 engine half an hour later. At first it only ran rough, missing on a cylinder or 2. The engineer tried to baby it, adjusting mixture, tweaking the cowl flaps, urging air across the cylinders, but the temperature needles crept up all the same. The engine had taken more shrapnel than they had realized. Oil leaked in fine mist. Fuel flow surged and sagged. Then, over the featureless grey of a snow-dusted landscape, the tachometer flickered, dropped, surged once more and fell to 0. "Number 4's gone," the engineer called. "It's dead." "Feather," Harris ordered automatically. The engineer obeyed, hitting the feather button, watching the propeller only partly comply. It slowed, blades beginning to turn, but they never reached the clean edge-on position that made a dead prop almost disappear to the wind. Instead, at the last fraction of its travel, the mechanism stuck. The propeller settled in a coarse angle, each blade still presenting a broad surface, now pinned like a windmill to the slipstream. The effect was immediate. The Liberator heaved as if some giant hand had grabbed its right wing. Drag surged, airspeed bled away. The control column bucked as the airflow over the wing changed. "Hold her," McKay said, jaw clenched as he added his strength to the yoke. Harris felt the sweat start on his back, despite the cold. They were down to 2 engines, 1 and 2, the inner pair of the two. Number 2 now carried most of the burden. Number 1 had taken a light graze from flak earlier, and its temperatures hovered closer to the red line than he liked. The Adriatic lay ahead, somewhere beyond the low hills, then the coast of Italy, then their field. Between here and there, hours of flying against winds that could strengthen or veer without warning. "Fuel report," he said tightly. The engineer consulted his gauges. "We're burning faster than planned," he said. "2's wide open. We'll make the coast, maybe. After that—" He did not finish. In the radio compartment, the operator hunched over his set, sending a short-clipped message in code. "Aircraft hit. 2 engines out. Attempting return to base. Position approximate." He knew that if they went down over land, perhaps some partisans would find them. Over water, it would be a matter of how fast the life rafts deployed and how close rescue units happened to be. When the low ridges finally fell away and the thin line of the Adriatic appeared ahead, grey under a pallid sky, the crew breathed a little easier, but the gauges did not care about morale. Fuel in the wing tanks continued to drain, fast but unevenly. The tanks, feeding the dead engines, still held thousands of gallons. They could not easily tap. The tanks, feeding numbers 1 and 2, dropped toward the minimums no mechanic ever wanted to see. In the engineer's station, Staff Sergeant Leo Alvarez stared at the markings Tom Carver had painted weeks earlier. Bold arrows, colors, and, off to the side of the valve cluster, the small metal plate with its block capitals. "In extreme emergency, feed 1 engine only. Close all others." "I'm looking at something down here," he called over the interphone. His voice shook, but not from the cold. "Make it quick," Harris shot back. "We're running out of ocean." Alvarez reached for the manifold handles, gloves off now, fingers stiff but more precise. He shut off feeds that no longer served engines that were dead weight. He opened cross feeds that the manual said should only be used under controlled conditions. He watched the needles respond slowly as fuel changed its path. Carver's markings. He muttered to himself, "All right, Tom, let's see if you knew what you were doing." The airplane shuddered again as a gust struck. The waves below stretched empty and indifferent in all directions. Clouds pressed low, flattening the light. "If we lose number 2, McKay said quietly, "we're not going to have much time." Harris did not answer. Ahead lay a long stretch of sea, then the faint promise of a coastline they could not yet see. Behind him, 11 men trusted that he would make the right decisions, though none of them could change the fact that metal and fuel had their own logic. It was then that Alvarez noticed something else. "Skipper," he said, "we can lighten her more." "How?" "Weapons? For a start, ammo, anything not bolted down." "Do it," Harris said at once. "Tell the boys to start throwing." The order rippled through the airplane. Gunners abandoned careful husbanding of ammunition and began to strip belts from their guns, feeding them out through open hatches into the slipstream. Spent casings that had pooled on the floor went after, swept into canvas bags, and then tipped into space. In the nose, the bombardier and navigator unshipped equipment they no longer needed, extra flak vests, tool rolls, a spare oxygen bottle with a slow leak. Each object hesitated in the doorway for a fraction of a second, then vanished into the slipstream. The act felt wrong and right at the same time. Wrong, because they had been taught to respect the gear that sustained the bombing effort. Right, because every pound they shed might give the struggling engines another mile. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the airspeed steadied, the sinking rate leveled. Four of a kind held on, its nose pointed toward a horizon where the faintest smudge of darker grey began at last to appear. "That the coast?" McKay asked. "Has to be," Harris replied. "Question is, do we get there still flying, or as swimmers?" Minutes dragged. The engines drummed, one with a slightly uneven beat now, the other straining under the load. Oil temperatures edged higher, then dipped as Alvarez adjusted the cowl flaps, and the extra deflector plates Carver had installed did their quiet work, forcing more winter air through the radiators. Alvarez pulled the small emergency cable that opened the bypass Tom had plumbed into the oil return. The movement was stiff. The cable had not been used since installation. Something inside the wing clicked. The engineer watched his gauges as if willing them to obey. The oil temperature, which had begun a slow, deadly climb, steadied. Pressure held. On any other day, in any other airplane, no one would have known why. Now, crossing a cold sea on two engines that were doing the job of four, that unapproved loop of hose and metal clamps meant that number two kept turning instead of seizing. By the time they reached the Italian coast, the fuel gauges that fed engines 1 and 2 were scraping the bottom of their marked bands. The tanks that had once supplied 3 and 4 still held fuel, but to reach it would take time to pump, to reconfigure that the airplane did not have at its current altitude. "Skipper," Alvarez said, "we can shift more, but we've got to pull back power on 1 to give the pumps a chance. If we don't, we run it dry on this setting." Harris stared ahead. The coastline was closer now, a real strip of darker land under the clouds, not just a vague promise. Somewhere inland, beyond low hills, lay their field. "If we pull back, we start losing height," McKay said. "If we don't," Alvarez replied, "we lose one entirely." Harris took a breath, made another choice. "All right," he said. "Ease. 1 back. Bring 2 to just under red line. Leo, work those valves. We're going to do this the ugly way." As power came back on number 1, the airplane sagged. The altimeter unwound faster. They crossed the coastline low, so low that some of the gunners caught flashes of waves breaking against rocks. Behind them, the engine's note shifted, harsh and insistent. Inside the hangar that afternoon, Tom Carver had been stenciling serial numbers on a spare cowling when the duty clock ran in. Breathless. "Ops wants you, Carver. Your ship's overdue. Radio says she's limping in beat to hell." Tom dropped the stencil brush, without thinking, leaving a smear of black paint on the floor. He wiped his hands on his coveralls as he ran, heart hammering. On the flight line, men were already gathering, looking to the eastern sky where damaged aircraft usually appeared, if they appeared at all. The first sign of 4 of a kind was the sound. Even before it was visible, the uneven drumming of 2 engines at high power carried across the damp winter air. Then the airplane came into view over the low hills, lower than anything should approach, nose slightly high, wingtips wobbling. Beside Tom, someone swore very softly. Another man made an involuntary gesture with his hand, half salute, half warding off bad luck. The Liberator came on, lining up for the steel mesh strip. Its landing gear was down already. At that height, there was no reason to risk a last-minute failure of the hydraulics. The dead props on 3 and 4 windmilled lazily. On the left wing, number 1 smoked a little. On the right, number 2 threw a shimmering heat haze back along the nacelle. In the cockpit, Harris had no attention left for anything except the runway. The control column was heavy in his hands. His feet pressed hard against the rudder pedals, compensating for the asymmetry that wanted to swing the nose sideways. "Flaps," he said. "Half," McKay replied. "If we go full, we may not climb out of ground effect if we bounce. Half it is." Behind them, the rest of the crew had braced themselves, gunners strapped in, heads down. The radio operator clutched the edge of his table with white fingers. In the waist, the men who had minutes earlier thrown ammunition into the sea now stared at the open hatches as the ground rose to meet them. Four of a kind crossed the field boundary so low that Tom could see details of the nose art. For a terrible moment, it seemed the airplane would land short, ploughing into the soft ground before the runway. Then, as if dragged by invisible hands, the main wheels cleared the edge and slammed down onto the steel mats. The first bounce was small. The second threatened to grow. Harris rode it, holding the nose slightly higher than training manuals ever recommended, unwilling to risk a prop strike on their remaining engines. The runway blurred beneath the cockpit. Then the nose wheel came down, hard, and the airplane began to roll in, something like a straight line. "Brakes," Harris said, though he could feel already that the runway would be enough. The dead weight of the feathered and windmilling props, the drag of partially extended flaps, the friction of tired tires on damp steel, all joined in, slowing them. When the Liberator finally shuddered to a stop at the far end of the strip, the world was suddenly, shockingly quiet. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, the side hatches opened. Men climbed out onto the wings, dropping down to the ground. Some stumbled and caught themselves. Others simply stood, looking back at the machine that had carried them there. Tom reached them at a run. Harris met him under the left wing, helmet still on, goggles pushed up, face grey with exhaustion. "What did you do to my ship?" Harris asked, breathless. "What did you do to my engines?" Tom shot back without thinking, then heard the tremor in his own voice, and stopped. For a second they just looked at each other. Then both men laughed once, sharply, the sound of something very close to hysteria. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Later, in the debriefing room, the questions came. "How many engines out?" "3 at the worst of it," Harris replied. "We had only number 2 really pulling. Number 1 was barely above idle for a while." "How far on one effective engine?" Harris glanced at the navigator, who had been scribbling figures even as the altimeter unwound. "From just after the coast of Hungary," the navigator said slowly, "to here. Call it 400 miles, give or take. Maybe a little more, depending on the winds aloft." The engineering officer frowned. "On one. That's not in the books." "No, sir," Harris agreed. "But it's what happened." They went over the sequence. Flak hits, the partial feather of number 4's prop, the fuel juggling Alvarez had done using the bright markings and the emergency valve pattern, the moment when he had pulled a cable, not on any standard diagram, and watched the oil temperatures respond. That last detail made the engineering officer's eyes narrow. "Who installed that cable?" he asked. Alvarez hesitated, glanced at Harris. Harris looked at Tom, who had been standing in the back of the room, unnoticed until now, oil still streaked on his hands. "I did, sir," Tom said. He stepped forward, throat dry. "As an emergency bypass for oil flow on 2, He groped for the words that would make it sound less like an act of defiance and more like what it had been in his head, a small, rational adaptation to a cruel reality. "The standard route is vulnerable to partial blockage under heavy load, and we were seeing a lot of overheating on return legs. I calculated that a short alternate path with a manually operated valve would give the engineer one more option if the main line started to choke." "You know the orders on unauthorized modifications," the officer said. His voice carried no anger, just weariness. "Those systems were designed back home with a lot of testing." "Yes, sir," Tom said. "They were designed for 4 engines sharing the load with equal fuel and clean air. We don't get those conditions here, sir." There was a long silence. "How many other ships have you altered?" the officer asked. "Just ours," Tom answered. Some labeling on others, but the bypass and the extra baffling are only on 4 of a kind. I kept it quiet. In case it did not work, the officer said. In case it got someone in trouble without helping anyone, Tom replied. Sir. The officer looked at Harris again. In your judgment, Captain, and did those changes matter? Harris thought back to the moment over the Adriatic when the oil temperature needle had steadied instead of climbing, to the way Alvarez's hands had moved over the valves without hesitation, guided by paint instead of memory, to the long, impossible stretch of water that lay behind them now, existing only in memory and maps. Yes, sir, he said. Without them, we would have put this airplane into the sea. We would not be sitting here. The officer nodded once, very slowly. All right, he said. Carver, from now on, you will document every alteration you propose, and you will bring it to me before you touch another bolt. If I say no, that's the end of it. If I say yes, we will test it on the ground first. Understood? Yes, sir, Tom said, heart pounding. And in the meantime, the officer went on, you will quietly, very quietly, explain to the other lead mechanics exactly what you did and where. We will not call it a modification. We will call it enhanced maintenance. I do not want to read about it in any stateside inspection reports, but I also do not want to lose another crew within sight of the coastline because an engine ran hot when it did not have to. He closed the file, a gesture that had the feel of a verdict. You bought these men 400 miles on one engine, he said. We would be very foolish not to learn from that. Word spread, as it always did, not through official channels, but through conversations in mess tents and over open-engine cowlings. Crew chiefs began to ask Tom questions they never would have admitted needing to ask before. How tight could they set the cooler doors without risking jam? Was it really possible to reroute some of the oil flow without starving another bearing? How much drag did a half-feathered prop truly add at cruise? Tom did not become a folk hero. He had no taste for that, and the war had little time for mythology that did not fit into communiques. But among the ground crews, his name began to come up in the same breath as the old master sergeants who knew Pratt and Whitney engines as if they were living animals. For the air crews, the changes were subtler. They noticed that the new paint around their fuel valves made it easier to do in seconds what had once taken careful thought. They heard from other squadrons about a Liberator that had come back from deep over enemy territory with only one prop turning and its wing skin ripped open by flak. They did not hear the part about the argument in the debrief room or the way the engineering officer had stared at the unauthorized cable as if it were a snake that could bite either way. That remained part of the hidden story, the underside of the official narrative. Years later, when the war was a memory on fading photographs and in the lines of older men's faces, historians would compile tables of mission losses and survival rates. They would write about the B-24's high aspect ratio wing, its long range, its vulnerability to wing fires, its tendency to become uncontrollable when icing built on its wings. They would mention famous raids, Ploiești, Wiener Neustadt, the bridges across the Danube, and list the squadrons that flew them. In appendices and footnotes, a few would note that some field units experimented with minor changes to standard systems, improved fuel management procedures, one report would say, enhanced oil cooling in combat conditions, another. The language would be bloodless, as if these were just technical choices, not the difference between men going home and water closing over their heads in midwinter. For Tom, the measure was simpler. It lived in the memory of standing at the edge of that runway, seeing his airplane come in so low the belly almost brushed the earth, smelling the hot metal stink of engines run just this side of destruction, and counting the men who walked away. After the war, he went home to Pennsylvania. He married a girl he had written to from the tented fields of Italy. He took a job at a small airfield that handled mail planes and the occasional surplus transport. The engines were different now, smaller, tidier, but the basic principles remained the same. Oil cooled, fuel flowed, heat collected in metal and had to be carried away. He did not talk much about the war. When his children asked, he would shrug and say he worked on engines. That was accurate enough in his mind. The part where forbidden fixes held a bomber in the sky over the Adriatic did not feel like something you recounted over dinner. It was his grandson who eventually heard the full story. One summer evening in the 1970s, sitting on a porch that looked out over a small town instead of a flight line. The boy, barely a teenager, asked why, in an old photograph, his grandfather's hands were black to the wrists. "That's oil," Tom said. "From a Pratt & Whitney. We used to come home looking like that every day." "What did you do?" the boy asked. "I mean, really do." Tom hesitated, then told him about the day 4 of a kind came home on one engine, about Harris's voice on the interphone, about Alvarez's fingers on the valves, about the plate that read "in extreme emergency," and the feeling of a thin steel cable snicking in its guide when someone, far away over a winter sea, pulled it. He did not tell the story as a tale of heroism. He spoke instead in the same quiet tone he had used in the hangar, describing how a line should be tightened, how a bearing should feel under the hand. "When something is running at the edge," he said, "you see where the design stops and the real world begins. The drawings back home, they can't cover everything. Sometimes you have to decide whether to leave it as it is, because that's what the book says, or change it, because the way it is will kill someone when things go bad." The boy listened closely. For him, wars were already history books and movies, not the cold weight of tools in a winter wind, but he understood enough to ask the next question. "Weren't you scared you'd get in trouble?" he said. "Of course," Tom answered. "There were regulations, inspections, people whose job was to say no. But there were also men climbing into those airplanes every morning. I could see them, I could hear them at night when they didn't come back. Trouble on paper didn't weigh the same as that." His grandson grew up, studied engineering, and found himself one day in another hangar, under another wing, looking up at a turbofan nacelle instead of a radial cowl. The settings on the testing rigs were digital now. The checklists lived on clipboards and later on screens. But when systems behaved in ways that did not quite match the neat curves in the manuals, he thought of that thin cable and the simple plate stamped "in extreme emergency." He learned the rules, and he followed them. Most of the time. When he broke them, carefully, it was never for convenience. It was when he could see that the book had not quite kept up with the sky. Decades after that winter over the Adriatic, a visitor walking through an air museum in Italy might notice a B-24 fuselage section with its ribs and stringers exposed, a cutaway wing showing the tangle of pipes and ducts that once carried oil and fuel. On a small plaque beside it, the text would describe the standard systems: 4 engines, 4 main tanks, cross-feed capability for emergencies. Somewhere in a paragraph, almost as an aside, it might mention that crews occasionally improvise changes in the field, including modifications to improve fuel transfer and engine cooling under combat conditions. There would be no names attached, no photograph of a mechanic with oil-blackened hands, no image of an engineer staring at a gauge as a bomber clawed its way home on a single turning prop. But if you looked closely at the preserved manifold, a cluster of valves and lines under a dusty plexiglass cover, you might see, bolted beside it, a small, hand-lettered plate that did not quite match the official typography. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.